just grab this straps.
Hi everybody. Thanks for joining us on People Gallery podcast. Tonight we have Miriana Nikolic. Hi Miriana.
Hi, Alyssa.
And we've got Tabitha.
Hello.
Tabitha the satellite. She will be joining us and she'll have a lot to contribute this evening on our chat about living in a post-socialist country and also living through war. Won't you, Tabitha? So much to say. I have to thank Mirjana for coming. I work with Mirjana. Mirjana is very motivational to me. She's very strong at work and I really look up to her. So I'm really glad that we can take this opportunity to talk to her now and hear about her experiences from moving from what was Yugoslavia or Serbia all the way to Australia. So thanks for joining us, Mirjana.
Thank you, Alyssa. And I must say before we even start that I just love the idea of the People Gallery podcast. When you told me about the idea, I just thought, how does this not exist yet? And I just think it's such a brilliant idea, and I have enjoyed all the episodes that I've heard so far, and I'm very glad and privileged to be here today with you.
Thank you. Well, you were the first person I asked to be my guest and the third guest I've had.
Yay. Well, 3 is a very symbolic number in Serbian culture. So
what does it mean?
That is a sign. We just have like 3 colors. I think it stands for something else as well, but 3 is like the number.
Okay.
In Serbia.
Well, there you go. This was deliberately done.
Very Serbian for me.
Very Serbian. So if I could just ask a little bit of background about you first, if I could just ask your age, if that's okay.
That's all right. I am 29. I'm just getting adjusted to it since I just turned 29.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you.
When was that?
It's been a couple of weeks, but
I
don't think of age as something bad.
No,
I just think of it as a level up. So I'm level 29.
Very good. Yes, level 29. That's a high achievement in gaming world, from what I can
Thank
understand.
you.
So you're 29. And the reason why I ask is because, just to put context into the reason why I'm interested in your story, is because as someone that's grown up in Australia, I'm also a child of migrant parents too. But when I think about communism, my parents came from a communist country in Cambodia, and that's why they escaped, and it was under war. Like, you think of war and communist, that type of sort of environment as being years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago. But, you're young, you're a millennial. If anything, you're walking down the street, other people out in our age group and other millennials just think you're like us, that we've all lived the same privileged life as each other. But that's not the case. You have lived through war as well yourself, your family have as well. So that's why I think it's a good lesson for people of our era to understand that, that this is continually happening.
Yeah, you're right. I do have a lot of these things like communism and socialism under my resume, but I really think that privilege is, not dependent on the country you live in. I am a refugee, but I was also very privileged in my own background for having had an opportunity to escape the war the way I did. So I think, privilege is everywhere, and it's just really important that we acknowledge those things when we speak about everything, whatever there might be. And having said that, I know of people who have been in circumstances that have lived through a war and have come out of it in a very, very different way that I have. So it's like one of those lessons learned where you have to acknowledge where your privilege comes from, and if you have any. And I'm very privileged to be sane and healthy and safe and living in Australia today.
True, as we all are. But that is a good point though. Like, when you put it that way, it's like, okay, yes, my family were privileged that they were able to escape to Thailand and get on an aeroplane to come to Australia, whereas most other people who escaped Asia had to go on boats, as most people know it, and they weren't sponsored. They had to fight to get into the country, sort of thing. So yeah, when you put it that way, that's true. But in terms of, we take for granted our freedom. So I'd like to share, what you've had to go through to know that we really should be so grateful for our freedom that we have here. So in terms of, so you're 29, and we, you lived in a post-socialist country. So, Yugoslavia became, communism ended in 1993. And then when I was growing up through the 90s, going through primary school, you always heard about Yugoslavia on the news and war, but it didn't really make any sense to me because I was just a kid. And then in 2003, the war ended, or Yugoslavia split into Serbia and Montenegro. Is that correct? No?
You're about right. It's really complicated. So much that I can't even tell you the exact point in time. Like, people would disagree with me if I gave you the exact date and when was the dissolution of Yugoslavia, when it became Serbia and Montenegro. So what happened in a nutshell was that after the Second World War, a few regions unified in their anti-fascism and established like a Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, which lived through the year that I was born, in the 1991. After that, a few republics of the Federation asked for independence, and then it became Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, consisting only of Serbia and Montenegro. And then sometime down the timeline, Montenegro decided that it no longer wanted to be part of the union, so we renamed ourselves to Serbia and Montenegro. And finally, now we have a situation where we have 7 republics, including one that is not internationally recognized, which is Kosovo, that was part of Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. That was initially Yugoslavia, which this flag represents. I'm very Yugo-nostalgic and very proud to be so. But the situation today is that we have 7 nations who claim their independence, and rightfully so, that came out of that Yugoslavia. So the timelines, 1991 would be the dissolution, roughly, but it wasn't settled, so 1993 could do. And then finally, I think Serbia and Montenegro officially split in 2008.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but like those are really like granular details that no one should know unless they come from the area. True. So you're absolutely right. You have a lot of detail.
Well, it's just the context that, this is all something that we can relate to. Like, we all know the 90s. We all know the 2000s, so this is all very recent for us. So in terms of you being very Yugo nostalgic, what country are you from, or where are you from, and what do you call yourself?
you probably asked me the longest possible question, or like the question that I can answer for 20 minutes.
My mum was a cleaner when I was growing up, and she worked for a Yugoslavian guy. So I've only ever known Yugoslavians. And I didn't realize, okay, Serbia, Montenegro is from Yugoslavia, so you're all kind of Yugoslavians, right? So what do you call yourself?
I would love for it to be the case. You must have stumbled upon someone who was very much nostalgic like I am.
Right.
Well, in the last 2 decades, the 90s and the 2000s, there's been a lot of emotion and a lot of grief. And people have started to call themselves like Croatian or Serbian or Bosnian, depending on where they come from. Montenegrin as well, as as part of the independence process. I choose to be Yugoslav, even though my passport is Serbian, because I share the idea or the mindset of the unity that we have achieved after the Second World War, which was based in the anti-fascism, and I really think that is one of my core values. I also come from a mixed marriage, as you would say. So my dad is ethnically Serbian and my mum is ethnically Montenegrin, which was at the time not so different at all because we were all Yugoslavs. But when the difference started to come around, now I'm a resident in Montenegro with a Serbian passport. So people ask me, where are you from? Well, if you if you ask me that question right now, like today, I can't travel to Montenegro because I'm not a citizen of Montenegro, and they won't let me through the borders because I'm a Serbian citizen, potentially carrying coronavirus, and they won't let me through the borders. So those are just the outcomes of like not being a citizen of a country at the moment. But I consider myself a Yugoslav, which is a country that does not exist. But you know, it's just a funny circumstance, which I hope will be resolved in the near future. Yeah. But ethnically Serbian, Montenegrin. Like if you ask my heart, I'm Yugoslav.
Okay. So when you say that you hope that it will be resolved in the future, what do you mean?
Well, this is mostly a practical issue right now. I'm a political scientist, so that's my undergraduate degree. I studied political science, and I don't want to go into this rabbit hole, but you know, Serbia and Montenegro are candidates to the European Union, and with that said, you know, minority citizens should be recognized and allowed to apply for citizenship into the countries that they reside for many, many years. And I've been a resident of Montenegro for since 1999, which makes it like 20 something years. And after the independence, we've been denied to apply for citizenship. So I'm hoping that this like international pressure or European Union pressure resolves the issue that many Serbian citizens face in Montenegro after the independence, which is very critical for, you know, refugees like I am in Montenegro. Now, I am privileged, going back to the first point, to not depend on that and be able to reside in a country where, you know, I don't depend on the social security or healthcare. But this is a really practical issue. There are a lot of, and I wouldn't know the percentage, but like maybe 30-40% of citizens of Montenegro who declare themselves ethnically Serbian face. And as a political scientist, I really believe that this is something that's very critical to resolve in the near future. I don't know what would it take, but hopefully, you know, with enough pressure from the European Union, which we're very keen on joining, this thing will happen.
I hope so too. So being that age, you, like, as we just spoke about, you would have lived through the war. What was that like? Like, do you remember it starting? Do you remember like a lot of it? How old were you then?
Oh, well, there were a few wars, first and foremost. So I was born in 1991, and I do not remember the Bosnia War and the war that, you know, got the whole of Yugoslavia, with Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia getting their independence. I got caught up in the Kosovo crisis that started in the 1998, but was really going through like the last 2 decades, with Kosovo being in the autonomous province of Serbia, with the majority of Albanian community, but governed by the Serbian minority, being that, you know, we were Serbia. So rightfully so, they had a lot of demonstrations asking for independence and more autonomy. And you know, poor government of Serbia decided to go the opposite way. So I remember being 6 at the time, 5, 6. I remember seeing demonstrations and like just masses of people shouting, you know, just like walking down the street and shouting for something. I was not allowed outside, so whenever I would have a glimpse of it, I would have to be put inside the house because I'm the minority. I'm the privileged minority of Serbia who lives in a province populated predominantly by, you know, Albanians. So, like, having said that, the media and my community didn't really share too much information with me. But that's something that I remember from the start of the war. But finally, when, you know, there was a lot of tension with like the pressures from the local community asking for more autonomy and independence, and then the international community asking Serbia to just recognize the independence or like give the rights to the Albanians, which I obviously didn't know back then. But there was a lot of tension, and there were a lot of threats being posed to Serbia that we will be bombarded. And I remember my dad not believing it. Every day they would announce it on the news, you're going to be bombarded, you're going to be bombarded. Like, we're not going to let Bosnia happen again. And my dad was like, oh, that's never going to happen. Finally, like, it was like 21st of March, 1999, we hear on the news that we're going to be bombarded. And my mom, who's a doctor, she's like, I'm out of here. And I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm out of here with my kids. And I remember, like, packing frantically. And we moved to Montenegro, to my grandparents' house. And that's all I really remember. Like, I remember fleeing on the last bus, full of, you know, Albanians who were also trying to flee, barely crossing the border, which was just close behind us. Mom says that we had encountered some tanks, which I do not recall, but I do remember the policemen with a lot of guns in the bus, potentially protecting us. But we were kids, right? So I don't remember a lot of things, but like putting things into perspective, my mom was on her own with 3 minor kids, fleeing the country, and like ever since I acknowledged that, I admired her. So that's the bit that I remember.
How old were your siblings?
So I have an older brother who's 6 years older than me, which made him 10 at the time, or no, 12. And my younger brother, who was, if I was 6, he was 2.
Yeah. So no one was really old enough to help your mum. She really actually was doing it all alone.
Yeah.
Because your older brother would have been too young as well. And
my dad was silly to let us go.
So your dad, is your dad reunited with your family?
Eventually.
Yeah.
Eventually. Well, he was mobilized. He was stationed in the city, because what happened was that NATO, the North Atlantic, whatever it stands for, I should know that, announced unilaterally, without the consent of the Security Council, which is very important for Serbia to be understood, decided that they're going to bomb Yugoslavia because they didn't like our treatment of Albanians, which is very wrong. You don't just decide to unilaterally bomb a country in the 21st century. They just decided so, and they started bombing. So my dad was mobilized as part of the defense force to defend the country against the attack of a foreign force. So he had to stay, and with all my uncles and cousins, he was on the front doing what he could.
If he had left with you, though, would he have been mobilized?
No, actually, it's really tricky, because Montenegro was a republic of Yugoslavia at the time. I'm not sure if he would have faced any charges against being in the army, but he definitely did not have any intention of leaving or surrendering. We perceived NATO's aggression, the way we call it, as something that was unjust and something that was very bully-like. And I would really, like, despite everything, and I stand with my Albanian friends right now with their, claim to independence for Kosovo, I really believe that a country should not just unilaterally bomb another country just like that, regardless whether that's United States of America or whether that's Russia or any other country in the world. So I think they did a wrong thing. I think they did it for different reasons, and they just made the conditions to look, something that would go down the history and could be included in textbooks. Not to say anything about, Serbia's blame about, potential ethnic cleansing or anything like that. So that all stands, but a country should not just bomb another country, especially if it just, if it qualifies as a democratic country. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, true. So your family was split. How did that affect your mum with her 3 children? Yeah, let's just have that part of the question, and then how did that impact your dad? Because obviously he had to fight. So yeah.
Well, to be honest, I never really unpacked that. I only remember that bus ride, and just recently I started thinking what would it be like for me to
Mm.
go with 3 minor kids on a bus that I don't even know
would have
they
been
would
around
cross.
your age even.
Yeah, but like I'm a woman now, and I'm like, well, if I had 3 babies, would I just leave my husband behind and just go for a border that I don't even know whether I can cross? And having in mind Bosnia and what happened before, like, the landmines, the bus can just stop and blow, and you just lost all your family, like looking at it from my father's perspective. So, like, everything is very surreal. I never really unpacked how my mum felt, but I remember thinking, oh, we just go for a summer vacation a bit early, because every year we would go to Montenegro for summer vacation to my grandparents.
And you would go on the bus as well?
Dad would drive us, but I didn't know.
Okay.
I didn't know.
So it's not like, going on the bus is the same thing as what you were doing and that's all you could understand, sort of thing. Okay.
I remember exactly the same thing, like waving at my dad from the back of the bus. He would always drop us at the bus station, and I was just going on a holiday, and he will meet us there. Or I seriously had a lot of fun looking at that police guy having a gun in his pocket. Wow. Me and my younger brother, we were stoked. We just did not. And I did think about this previously. I was like, what was my mum, like, what was she thinking? And she says we saw some tanks, like, going the other way. Like, can you even imagine, like, 3 minor kids? And just to put things into perspective, like, I know of stories that people in Bosnia did exactly the same thing, and just being pulled out of the buses and just put on the line and just shot. That's what civil war is, right? In those circumstances, she wouldn't have been able to do anything, like absolutely nothing. My dad couldn't have done anything. Now, was that like, a calculated decision? I don't know. We ended up being just fine. We crossed the border. It was just fine. Me and my younger brother, we had a party. But how did my mum feel, and how does she feel these years after? Obviously, she was relieved after the war, and my dad obviously wasn't shot or anything. We never had any immediate family being hurt in the war, so that's where I draw my privilege from. But, like all that trauma, it was funny. Actually, thinking of Sandra right now, we moved to Budva, which is a coastal town very close to Italy. So being that we moved to Montenegro, we could call landline to Kosovo. So we would watch Rai Uno, Rai Due, which was in Italian, but we could see, Italian planes, being that Italy is in NATO. Yeah. We would see like 6 planes going to Montenegro. So Mum would pick up the phone and call my dad. So we were like basically acting like a spy kind of,
country. That's funny. Yeah, so that's good that you still had communications with your father, though, like in those conditions. So once you got to Montenegro, everything was okay. Like it was just living like normally. So the part of war that you experienced was just that glimpse of the bombardment and then the escape.
Yeah. And I really feel very privileged for not have had to go through any camps or have any shortage of anything, really. Like we did grow up under sanctions and under, very modest circumstances, but we had a shelter, we had enough food, we were never short of anything. And, thinking from Australian terms, it's rough, but, it was always just fine. Like my mom was a bit, frantic when the siren, the Air Force Defense siren went off. We had to go in and we had to stop playing, but that was the extent of it, right? Okay. There were no targets in Montenegro, like a few airports, nowhere close to us. So it was for a long time I didn't even consider calling myself a refugee, being that I just moved from one house to another, started school within a month because I was so eager. And that was it, and I was recognized for my different accent.
Yeah.
And, I just don't think that's it is legitimately an obstacle. Like a child should not go through that. But I have come out of this, and way back when, much more resilient, and just understanding my privilege, like looking back, is, I think, really important.
So when you got to Montenegro, did you go to your mother's family's place, or did you have to go to like refugee like camp or something? Because when I think about like when my family arrived in Australia, they all were taken to Nunawading. They had all these like housing commission homes that they put all the refugees in, and they lived there for as long as they needed to.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to have immediate family that would take us in, and it's part of that culture, like a Balkan kind of thing, where it's without asking, you can just live with someone. Like
you
same
just in
don't
Asian
ask.
culture. It's just generous hospitality.
It's definitely not Australian.
People are hospitable. Yeah,
and not only that, we came to our grandparents' house. So my grandpa, being that it's a tourist kind of town, my grandpa has like a 3-level story house full of rooms to rent to tourists. So at the time it was March and it was the wartime. All of our extended family, not related to my grandpa at all, came with us because, where they're going to go. So it was like the whole house was filled with our cousins, because that it's the time that they're in need and it's the wartime, and you just do what you can, and it's not, it's nothing different than anyone else would have done. And I know multiple people doing the same in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You just help out. Like the community sense is really strong in the Balkans. So yeah, we just moved, and really I did not even feel the transition.
So even though Montenegro was partially impacted by the war, it sounds like it was pretty good conditions, apart from there were curfews and that was it.
Yeah, that's right, because it's such a nothing country.
Okay.
It's like based on tourism, has 2 airports and maybe some military. And yeah, it was the safest place to be at the time.
So you're very lucky. You're right. You did have a lot of privilege to be able to get there at a good time. Now, tell us the story about your dad. He obviously had to stay back, or he wanted to, and then he had to because he had to protect or defend the country. Can you tell us his story of how that was for him, if he shared any of that with you, and then how he was able to return back or meet you guys?
Yeah. So my dad, I think, has experienced the most sort of negative impact of the war, obviously, having had to lose his family, like, temporarily, and he always knew that was the case, but it wasn't easy to stay home and defend the country. And although he didn't experience any hardship, like he wasn't on the border in the snow, he was just stationed in the city. I can only imagine how it was for him at the time. Having heard all the stories from Bosnia and like all the other civil wars, like things happen, like bombs fly around and they miss the targets. So it must have been quite hard. But I think he'd never shared too much after the war. So what happened, we fled in 1999, and in 2003, when everything was settled, we were bombed for 3 months, and then we decided to capitulate and decided to like say okay to NATO, and we withdrew our troops. In 2003, we managed to sell our house, and Dad moved to Montenegro with my grandparents. So none of them were hurt. But the psychological impact of war was so very visible to him that made me think about the consequences of war that you wouldn't necessarily hear on the news. So it's not just like what happens in the battlefield; it's really what stays with people, and it goes through generations. And with that said, I now acknowledge that I'm a refugee, having experienced all those consequences, not necessarily being in front of a tank or being hit by a bomb, which is a real consequence, but like a psychological impact is quite strong. So my dad, so he left the war unhurt, had to flee and lose all his life. So, but at the time he was, I guess, 40 something, and he had to, leave his house that he was building. So we had an old house and a new house he was building for his family, had a network of friends, and his best man living next door, and his cousins. So, like, it's a small town, you know everyone. You're there for generations and you just need to leave. Like a year after that, you buy a place and all your cousins and all your support network is across the country. So I actually think that, he felt a bit depressed and has, gone through like coping mechanisms that he would have never shared with us kids because he was trying to protect us. But it was very, very visible. And I can only imagine, what families go through when they don't have as much, financial or material support like we did. Like, it would have been much, much harder if we were in a camp. Like, being a father of 3 minor kids, one of them who needs like special care, and not being able to provide for them. And by the way, my dad never worked after the war because he just felt either stigma or, inability to apply for a job in a circumstance where his dialect would be recognized, and he would be, looked as less worthy. So that those are like all the psychological impacts that I think my dad had to deal with. And I think a lot of my understanding about the war comes from him. I don't think he ever got to terms with what happened. I don't think no one ever does. Like, my grandparents never did either. They just stayed at home. We bought a beautiful home. We had a beautiful family. We had a dog and a cat and a turtle. And we were all very healthy and going to school and very good students. And, you just appreciate what you have. But what they didn't have is a next door neighbor that they grew up with. They didn't know everyone in the village. And that's a sense of belonging that you cannot replace. And it impacts you psychologically. Now, that's something that I just like come across, like, just thinking about my dad's life, because he passed away like a few years ago. But I think he was mostly impacted by the war, having like lost his whole entire life. My life just started when we moved, and I barely noticed because I just rejoined the class, and I was like, oh, well, these people are laughing at me because I have a different accent. Well, whatever, I'll just adjust my accent. And I had a bit of spice, so it's fine. But yeah, it was, most of my understanding comes from my dad and how he coped with it.
Yeah. So when you said that your dad, he didn't work again because he was conscious of, how he stood out as being different. But was there any sort of, do you think that, because that was obviously him in Montenegro, but were the Montenegrins against the Serbians being there? Like, was it, even though he felt that way, was that really a problem?
Not necessarily, but we moved from a small city to a small city. So, a lot of things work, you recommend someone and that's the way networks work. Like, someone and they know someone.
Yeah.
And no one knew my dad. And
okay, so it was that difficulty.
Montenegro is a very special country. It's a very small place with not too many people. It's maybe 500,000 people in the whole entire country, and we are known by our last name. And the first question that an elderly person would ask you is, like, who owns you, practically? Like, which family do you come from?
Yeah, right.
And my family's name would come from a part of Montenegro, which is north, but my family is not actually from Montenegro, it's from Serbia. It's the same last name. But they would assume things based on that. And if they didn't know my dad's name, they wouldn't necessarily put a lot of stars against my name. And I just think that goes in addition to, starting your life over, which is already too hard, which I can now absolutely empathize with. coming to Australia and previously going to France, just starting your life from scratch, just understanding where's left and where's right, and where do you go and buy screwdrivers or, which is Bunnings.
Yeah.
In Australia. I couldn't have known that.
But that makes sense though, because your dad was in his 40s. It's even more harder to adjust at that stage. Yeah.
And as we grow old, we don't make as many friends, and you just stick with the ones that you have, and it's very hard to break those circles. So what he ended up doing was focusing on his own family, and he did end up having some friends and having a community, but it wasn't his community, which is something that I'm dealing with right now. Like I have enough friends to consider Melbourne home, but my friends are back home. So I'm like I do have a privilege of maybe going back and just continuing my life back home, but it's when you don't have an option, you just feel defeated. And that takes the psychological toll, I think.
Yeah. So you were 8 years old when you left Serbia, let's say, and then you were probably 5 years older when you saw your dad again, right?
Oh, that seems correct. Yes.
Yeah. So how was that for you, or it didn't really impact you because you guys were regularly talking all the time? Like, do you remember the day when you saw your dad again after 5 years?
Oh, to be honest, I'm really struck by this question. I did not even consider the timelines. I don't remember. He couldn't have been able to come because of the wartime. It must have been 5 years before I saw him, but
do you remember the first time because it would have been years before you would have seen him again. So do you remember that time? Oh, really?
No, and it's really surprising to me that I never thought about this. I just thought, in the times of those circumstances, your mum is under pressure and things are happening, right? You don't get to cry for dad, or I guess we were just like,
when he turned up again, you're like, oh, dad's here. So
like, mum is a bit upset. They say it's wartime. Maybe we should just shut up and just wait for it, for dad to come home. Yeah,
so you just
funny.
Always knew dad will come home, and then one day he came home, you're like, okay, he's home now, and it was just back to normal in the sense in another country that way.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I'm a black sheep of my family, so I was always away from the family. And when dad came to Montenegro, they bought a house, and I was away with relatives in like northern province of Serbia, and I came home and I was like, this is our new house, and I was like, okay. I don't think I process things very well.
So do you feel like with you and your family escaping war as a refugee, were there any lasting impacts? Did you see that in your mother? Did you see it in maybe your older brother even? Yeah. What were the lasting impacts?
Yeah. I know this is a conversation about war and like it should be grim and all, but my god,
this
there
is
are consequences that I can talk about that are extremely funny.
Yeah,
like, if you're like me, my mom is a hoarder. Like having gone through sanctions, she never throws anything out. I do not know how to fix that. I'm just gonna lighten up the conversation. It's like it's a problem.
I think that's the same with my mum. I would walk into her ensuite bathroom and there'd be like every single the junk mail catalogs from all the shops in there. I'm like, why are you keeping this? This is from like 2012, and there'd be an axe in there, and I'm like, this is not supposed to be for a bathroom. Like, what do you need all these things in here for? Sort of thing.
You never know. You never know.
It must be a war thing because her aunties were doing that too. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's troubling when you have a house full of like gadgets and like. We have like 3 mixers and 3 microwaves. And I'm like, we don't need these many things. But you never know. You never know.
Yeah.
Because, when you go through something like that, you really never know. Like, you're responsible for these kids. And you have to feed them. And how are you going to feed them unless you have like a 200-liter freezer? we can store food for like the next 5 years. So when Corona happened, I was like, Mom,
they would have been prepared for sure.
Chill.
Yeah.
You have food for the next 5 years. And it's very typical. Like back home, everyone has freezers. Like our freezers are bigger than our fridges. Like there's literally nothing we buy from the supermarket that's not like eggs, because we don't hold chicken. But like chicken meat or any kind of meat, it's all frozen. Like, and you just take it out. Like you have like 300 kilograms of meat. Which is a good thing. I'm just mentioning it as like a funny thing to say about my mum that I like to criticize. But long-lasting impacts, I think, definitely a toll to my dad's mental health.
Yeah.
Which is a concept that doesn't even exist in the Balkans.
Yes.
Like mental health, what is that? Like you just cope and you survive.
Yeah.
It's just, I actually, like, I don't want to be insensitive, but like being strong in Australian terms is just like being normal in Balkan terms, and being resilient in the Balkan terms is just like the next level. You can survive anything, and I feel that power in me right now. Like having moved so much, I can survive anything. So that's a positive benefit of long lasting impact. But I think I was just right on the level of maturity when I was like 8 or 9 to understand that my accent is a bit different, that my sentiment about where I come from is a bit different than my younger sibling. So we are 3. My older brother speaks only one dialect. I speak both of the dialects, and my younger brother speaks only Montenegrin dialect. So in 3 siblings speaking 2 different things, but I can mix. So being able to mix the dialects consciously, I have been like put. I don't know how to say it. Like I'm dislocated. I feel like I don't know where home is. But it's just like right. a minor, like a quirky thing about me. I don't think it would have been an issue if I weren't aware of my privilege. But it's just like, people ask me wherever I go. People ask me where my accent is from. So that's why I laugh in Australia when they ask me where my accent is from. Like I'm from nowhere. Like,
yeah, right.
My accent doesn't belong anywhere. So that's the longest lasting impact I think that will follow me for the rest of my life. Being a refugee and now acknowledging it without any shame, that I am a refugee and that I don't have a home.
Yeah, right.
And yeah, that's really I've realized that only in Melbourne. Being accepted as an immigrant has made a really, really positive impact on me and how I perceive myself. And only in Melbourne I have decided to actually acknowledge the fact that I have experienced, the consequences of war, and that I have been impacted by, the negatives of a war. Because previously I was like, oh, I can't even qualify. I'm like, I just moved from one house to another. But it's not true. I have lived through a lot of negative consequences and am experiencing every day what it feels like to not be brought up in a place where I was born, with all the support network, with parents who are completely solid mentally and have progressed in their lives and not have lost what they've worked so hard for. Like my mum is a gynecologist, and she had to put on hold her final exam because of the war. She only graduated and became a gynecologist like 10 years later. Now think about that in your own terms. Like I only have an undergraduate degree, but if someone put my graduate degree on hold, I'd start a freaking war.
Yeah.
So it's those are things that I have experienced, and only in Australia I'm considered exotic or like different for being a refugee, and people are genuinely interested in what it was like. And I just realized that there is no shame against it, which is very different to any other part of the world, because I lived in France and I lived in other places in the world.
And you felt shamed there for being a refugee?
Absolutely. I would never call myself a refugee. If you're a refugee, you're poor, you don't belong where you are, you don't deserve what you have, you're constantly being helped, and in, oh my God, very not considerate ways. Like, I had a backpack being given to me in my primary school with like a UNDP logo. Now, being a political scientist, like, I just don't understand the branding. Like, don't put like refugee like tag on a kid that receives a backpack. I had to carry that backpack because I didn't have any other.
But why did they do that though?
Well, development agencies, like, they like to show like the
sponsorship. Or they say that they're helping this many people, and it's okay.
It's not. It's just like I can't take any. I can't criticize, because I understand. I work in public service, so I understand what like, not having gone through that path, you just don't understand the intricacies. And that's why it's really important to have people who have gone through those circumstances be on those boards and have a say in those meetings when they design the logo or whatever. But what I'm saying is, like, it was just a minor thing, but it did stigmatize me quite a lot. So much that I, moving to Budva, which is like a high-end, very much posh Montenegrin city, wanting to be Monaco or Monte Carlo, you don't get to be a refugee with an accent. You have to fit in. You have to get friends. And even now, I get asked, "Oh, your accent sounds from," but now I have enough resilience to say, well, I come from there, which is better than you, or like, these are my circumstances. But back when I was 7 or 8, I couldn't say those things.
That's really interesting. I find it so interesting that even though you are half Montenegrin by blood anyway, that they could still be that way. And that's really quite strange. It's good that you can feel like you're accepted as a refugee here, possibly because most people in Australia are, particularly in Melbourne, that's for sure. Everyone here, or a lot of the residents in Melbourne, are refugees, and they've really made themselves known. Like, they have all these amazing restaurants and food, and it's put Melbourne on the map because of the refugee status. So welcome to Melbourne. Stay here.
Thank you. Thank you. And I really, like, if I can say anything about Australian culture, and I love this country so much that I call it home, and I feel so Australian right now. Apart from all the, the good people and the welcoming people, I feel like being a refugee is my strength here. And I wish that everyone who arrives to Australia feels the same way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, that's really interesting that you said that about the other parts of Europe, when they probably should have been able to understand that more. So, yeah, I thought that's really interesting what you just said. With your dad, did he share much of his experiences with you guys? Or you just observed it? You just saw that he was a different man?
Well, he's very much like me. He likes to, whenever things get uncomfortable, he just likes to throw a joke in there. So he did tell us what he did during the wartime, like he would drive a truck places, blah, blah. So we did get an insight, but I disagree with my dad quite a lot on the policies that the government was perpetually just enforcing. He was part of the leading party locally that was accused of many bad things that happened back then. And when I started being educated and started political science degree, and being a Yugoslav, I blamed a lot of things on like nationalist agenda, proclaiming Serbia against the world, blah blah, that his party stood for. So politically, he wasn't sharing too much. He would just like giggle to my little comments, being a 19-year-old having a political stance. But outside of that, I think everything was really transparent in our family. We knew what was going on. we didn't really know the depth of it, but we got the information from the media, or the general sentiment that we are the victims, NATO is bombarding us, and it's us against the world, like it was in the World War One and World War Two, like Serbia against everyone, which I realized a few years ago that it wasn't the case. Having had a bit of research and having gone back to Kosovo, now that I speak English and I can actually communicate to my Albanian friends and peers, I understood that, the other side of the war actually experienced as much or even more than I did. So this just gave me a whole lot of perspective on, what war is about and how people get put against each other for different reasons. So I actually, like, having spoken to people and having had my dad's perspective and my family's perspective, it just drove me to a lot more empathy and understanding of how wars are, like, completely unnecessary, and how people can be instrumentalized for particular groups' purposes. Now, speaking to my Albanian friends, I'm very, like, loving towards Albanians, and have many friends, and I'm very proud of that. Like, I only see the bad side of the war, and have grown past what my family, my immediate family, or my immediate community would have shared with me. So regardless of my, some of my family members would have shared with me, I formed my own opinion on what happened and what should happen. And when you ask me on how many republics did Yugoslavia dissolve into, I say 7, because Kosovo is de facto its own state, and people in Kosovo, being Albanian, should be able to, speak their own language, go to their own schools, and be educated in their own national language. And I'm in full support of that.
So is your history of what you went through, is that what made you study political science?
Sorry about that. No.
Or was that just your own interest, as it was?
It's interesting to think about, like, what drove me. My dad was always very political. Yeah, I might have been influenced by him, but predominantly, I think just being in a debate club when I was in high school what drove me to, like, just consider a different perspective. I understood that you can defend each end of every story, and it just, it's a benefit to you if you look things from different perspective. So having that in my thoughts and in my brain just propelled me to pursue that career.
So in terms of socialism and that type of economy, how do you, so, and obviously now you live here in Australia, which has a different type of economy, how do you notice, like, what differences have you noticed and what benefits are there?
It's being even nostalgic, it's a really hard topic to talk about, because Australia stands for everything that Yugoslavia would have stand for in the way I would want to see it. Now, people would disagree with me on what Yugoslavia was and how everything would eventuate in a hypothetical situation now and circumstances. I really think what Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia stood for was, a stable economy with workers' rights, with healthcare, education that's free, for the community and the society to benefit from it.
Well, that's the idea behind socialism.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what socialism is and what it stands for, and which is the reason why I'm a lefty and a socialist, a very loud socialist. But I do recognize that some of the countries have misplaced the idea, depending on different circumstances, and Yugoslavia not necessarily achieved the dream, but it came pretty close. My parents, when they were young, they had free education. The literacy from after the Second World War rose to like 90% after like 30% before the war.
That's interesting.
So like the country did quite a lot for the poor people, just getting them literate, getting them in the workforce, which I'm very appreciative of. Now, coming into the 80s and 90s, where globally we were struggling, Yugoslavia didn't cope that very well, which I believe is the reason behind the war. Every war, in my opinion, has an economical background, and everything just got perverted in the 90s. Tito, who was our leader in the up to the 80s when he died, he was a lifelong leader of Yugoslavia, who established Yugoslavia and then later on became the leader. He died in the 1980s, and we didn't have Plan B. We didn't have a succession plan. We started with like a communal presidency. So the difference between those policies and Australian policies are not very much different in intent. They're very different, however, in practical terms. So what happened with Yugoslavia during the 90s was that the pension system, the healthcare system, the educational system just deteriorated during the civil war, sanctions, war, like different circumstances. Like the economy just went into recession, huge inflation. We didn't recover until like mid 2000s, so it's not comparable. But Australia seems to have something that stands for stability and just reliability, that I believe is a socialist dream, or any social democracy should strive for, like Sweden or like any Nordic country. And again, it's a socialist dream, although Australia would never recognize it as socialism. But having stable economy where the government actually helps in times of need, like Corona, where we have job keepers and job savers,
provided,
for everyone in the economy to be able to cope with the circumstances, is the definition of socialism. Healthcare, which is supplemented by the government, where you occasionally pay or not pay, or you have bulk billed bills from the doctor, is something that Yugoslavia strived for. Now, during the 90s in the Balkans, each and every one of the republics failed, and that because being divided, having less strong systems in place, we just all winged it. And the healthcare system could not be worse, the education system could not be worse, the general value and the sentiment about the institutions and the trust in the institutions could not be lower. So that's the main difference, I think, between the Balkans and Australia right now. Is it by the fault of the leadership? I wouldn't know. I guess so, being that Australian leadership wouldn't just jump into a war. But Australia is also very privileged of being an island and no state seeking independence or have an autonomous province looking for having insurgencies and militaristic paramilitary organizations that they have to deal with. So it's different circumstances, but I appreciate Australia for having a plan in hand, regardless whether it's Liberals or Labours who are in power. There is a stability of government, and where I feel safe as a young millennial and an immigrant to potentially invest in a property, which means a 30-year long loan, trusting the banks and trusting my government that it would help me out in times of need, that if in 20 years time there's a massive recession, that I wouldn't be left on my own. So that's something that I really appreciate about Australia, and working in an education system, I couldn't be more in support of what Victoria and Australia are doing in terms of the education, and not necessarily just in factual information based education, like how much our kids know, but how much, you know, we teach empathy and kindness, and I think that's like very postmodern, but very Australian and very important globally.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what the difference is in terms of government, where, you know, the idea of socialism is very attractive and it does last and can be successful for a period of time. But in terms of having a democratic sort of economy, it allows it to be sustained for a while. And that, so even though we have the same sentiments as the social, I guess, you know, socialism, having the democratic or having the government help support that allows us to ensure that security that you just talked about, which is obviously something that if maybe Yugoslavia had that, they could sustain it longer as well.
Absolutely, and it's really important to know that Australia is really rich as a country. When you have a lot of resources and when you have a lot of money, it's really easy to like just splurge and like give it a go, and it fails and you give it a go another time. You know, when you have, you know, very scarce resource, then you have to do what you can do, and if you fail, it's noticeable. So there are now many reforms that, you know, any European country apart from Switzerland and like the wealthiest countries that can do, and have an opportunity to just do it again. So that's like really the difference between, you know, a developed country and a developing one. But I guess, you know, like we would have been, the Balkans and Yugoslavia would have been a developed country by now if we haven't gone through the mess that we did. So it's on us.
So even though it's been, say, maybe 17 years since the war ended in Yugoslavia, do you see when you return to Montenegro or when you go back there, can you still feel the impact of that?
Not in Montenegro. Not in Montenegro because we are very touristy and we have, you know, a lot of foreigners come around and we pretend to be better than what we are, and no one would ever, you know, recognize that there are any issues. And they're really none. They're really none.
But in the other parts of Yugoslavia, though.
Yeah, there would be, you know, instances where, you know, you would just still feel uncomfortable. Like I would call it uncomfortable because I'm very proud Yugoslav, and I think less of people who are not. So I have that, you know, pride in me to whenever someone like even tries to insult me or be rude to me, I'm like, you know, I have that, like, I don't know, leverage against them, while other people would be offended. So going back to Kosovo, I had to endure quite a lot of criticism on what Serbian government did, and I was in a school with a lot of Albanians who, you know, just had a lot to say about, you know, how their community was, you know, molested and treated poorly, and, you know, what their parents had to go through, and I had to take all that like I did it personally. So that's one of the instances. Now I personally put myself into that, so it's a political discussion that I signed up for. But if you went to I guess Croatia, sometimes, you know, people had their immediate family, you know, die in wars, like those things you can't just go, you just can't let it go off. So people take it against you regardless of whether you were in the war or not. So, you know, you would hear instances where like people would just not be, they would just not be as nice to you as they would to any other tourist.
It's really interesting.
But I like to focus on the opposite. You know, I find there is a lot of common ground in Yugoslavia and that we are stronger than ever. Like apart from Albanian community who speak Albania, we all speak the same language with a funny accent here and there. I love to go to Bosnia and, you know, immerse myself in the Muslim culture, and I love to go to Croatia and just, you know, try their specialties. And I feel as Croatian as I feel Bosnian or, you know, Serbian or Montenegrin, and I think that we really have a strong common core, which is Balkan and Yugoslav, and that doesn't stand for any adversity or differences, but rather the commonality, which is the reason why I'm a Yugo nostalgic. I really try to focus on those, common things. And now more than ever with internet and, the share of information, like our region is stronger than ever. And it just shows that whatever the instances that the international community was showing were the reason for the war, like religious incentives, or we just couldn't stand each other because we just hate Muslims, or we hate Catholics, or we hate Orthodox, stand no ground, because we are one same community, and these parts of our identities were just instrumentalized against each other. And of course anything can be weaponized. And with friends that I have right now, I can just say that, a Bosnian can be closer to me than any Serbian, or a Croatian can be closer to me than any Serbian. So, and with that said, I don't like to call myself half Serbian, half Montenegrin, because what's the point? I come from the region, and that's what the region stands for. And we do have a little small community where, the worldview, not necessarily thinking of any reunification of Yugoslavia, but, it's still there. It exists.
Yeah, true. And in Melbourne, since you've lived here, have you been a part of the, I guess, Yugoslavian, Serbian, Montenegrin community here?
No, not really. Not really. And the only reason behind that is because I have done this a few times now, started my life from the beginning, and I just acknowledge the necessity of immersing yourself in the local culture. So not grasping to the community or the known is really important. It was really important for me back then when I moved for the first time. So I didn't reach out to my community. I reached out to Australians the way they are, and one of them is you. And I just try to learn what are Australians like. And some of the Australians that I know are Yugoslav as well. But the common denominator is that we're Australian. And, after so many years now, I can say that I'm equally as Australian as I'm Yugoslav. And now we have two common denominators, with my fellow Yugoslavs and fellow Australians.
Yes.
So, yeah, I've been to a Serbian or Macedonian food festival every once in a while when I...
Oh, those things are always fun.
But not necessarily. I've been to a gig or two. But yeah, obviously it's very nice to see the fellow countrymen and, sing all the songs, and it's nice, but it's not what I pursue. When I go home, I indulge myself in these things.
Fair enough.
But not here.
So, as our last question tonight, what do you have to say to people like me who've always lived in a free country and haven't gone through war? I've only experienced it through the stories of my family. I'm first generation Australian, I'm the first one born here, and really have taken it for granted. So, what do you have a message for people around the world? There's people in Italy listening as well. What we should appreciate or learn from someone like yourself who is a refugee and has had to live through war?
There's there are PhD books published on the topic. It's a really a deep subject. So I wouldn't necessarily say be mindful of someone's being a refugee. Just being mindful of the cultural differences. And it's been a journey for me to adjust. Although I'm a highly educated, well-traveled, English-speaking and multiple languages speaking person, very extroverted, I still didn't fit well because the intricacies of a culture are not necessarily written anywhere on a list where I can just tick, tick, tick. These are things that you recognize every day and by, trying and failing. So just have a bit of patience. So if someone comes from a different culture and they have an accent, just take a step back, And if they speak a bit too directly, or they might seem rude, or they might come across as something that not necessarily, feels familiar, don't just read through it. Just take a step back and give them a chance, because we're all adjusting, and I would say 500 times better than I was like 5 years ago when I first came here. And now I'm fully Australian. I know all the intricacies because I failed in all of them. But it's really hard to understand where you're mistaking when no one wants to say, they have a reaction, and there is no manual to know how to go about things, right? Like in Australia, quick tip, thank everyone for everything. Just like thank them 3 times. Just thank them.
Be grateful.
Yeah, just like someone closes the door for you, thank them.
Yes.
Passes the salt, thank them. It's a lot of courtesy, and that does not come, it's not natural in my culture. As a matter of fact, when I go back and I thank people, they take it offensively because it sounds like passive aggression, like, don't you thank me? Like, this comes without saying.
Interesting.
It's really funny. I experienced that within my own family. So it's, these things, having lived through them is what like made me a better person. So now when I meet someone from a different culture, wherever they might be, Mongolia to like, I don't know, Colombia, I have a bit of reservation before I judge, because what seems to me as rude might be a very genuine try from their end to be nice and friendly and generous. So if everyone just knew that 5 years ago when I first came around, it would have been really, really nice and much, much easier for me.
Right. So we need to practice to understand that people come from different places and have different mannerisms and cultures, and be accepting of that.
Yeah, and just try to understand.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thanks to you, mainly Agatha, and for joining us tonight. Oh, I just want to touch her. Thanks for joining us tonight, and really appreciate the time that you spent with us, talking to us about your experiences and displaying them in our gallery.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to all the other episodes because I'm really enjoying your podcast. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Have a good night. Sandra's here.
Bye.
Thank you. And Agatha.
The cat was
this is my cat. She was. See you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
I don't know how to turn this off.